So today we're going to talk a little about nests and nesting. So we all know that birds make nests, and a common misconception is that nests are homes. Nests are not bird homes. Nests are, think of them as a cradle or maybe a nursery where you raise young to the point where they can be on their own, and then leave the nest and you don't use the nest for any other purpose. Nests are not to go back to or to live in for shelter protection. They are to raise young. Sorry, this is the same picture as last time, but it's for a slightly different purpose because we're going to talk about where birds nest. So birds build nests to raise young, and birds, young birds and eggs are like superfoods. Everything wants to eat an egg or a baby bird. I mean, even things that don't usually eat meat will often eat an egg if they come upon it because they just they're so rich in energy and nutrients. So that means nests are very vulnerable. So birds go through a lot of energy to protect their eggs. And there's two different methods to do this. You can do this through camouflage. So if you look here, this is a killdeer nest, and you can see that it'd be very easy to walk by that and never notice it. So you can use camouflage or inaccessibility, right? So you can build your nest way in the top of a tree, or like the peregrine falcon that we talked about, you can build it on the side of a cliff or on the side of a building where no one's going to be able to get to it. Doesn't mean you're completely protected because maybe other birds might like to feast on your eggs or your young. That does happen. But those are the two strategies that are used for protection. And let's see if I can get this to work. There we go. So some birds are what we call colony nesters. Most birds are not. Most birds nest on their own. They defend their own territory like we talked about last week. But some birds are colony nesters, so they all gather in one place and nest together. Why would you do this? There's some reasons. One is that if a predator comes, we've talked about birds and how they're able to gather together and mob a predator that might be coming. So this way, you're all right there. You can kind of protect, as a group, you can protect yourself against a predator. This is often the case where there's an unpredictable food source, because what seems to happen is that they all sort of watch each other, right? So you can kind of have scouts that go out and find food in the other birds while they're busy nesting, and they need to find foods both for themselves and for their babies. They can watch the bird that actually finds food and go to that same place and find that same food source. So there seems to be a correlation between birds that do colony nest and birds that have an sort of unpredictable food source. It's sort of in different locations. Sometimes it's where a shortage of nesting sites. So if it's a bird that nests in trees and it's a savanna bird where there's only a certain amount of trees around, then perhaps you might have more colony nesters in that situation. So all in all, it's about 13% of bird species. So most bird species are not colony nesters. One colony nester that we do have around here would be the great blue heron. And they make what is called a rookery, where they all come together, and it's a pretty impressive sight. You know how big great blue herons are. Think about having 30 to 40 of their nests with their big babies all making quite a racket. It's a pretty impressive sight. So if you ever get to go to a great blue heron rookery, I highly recommend it. So nests are for the purpose of raising young. And I'm not going to get into this very much because next week we're going to talk about development. But there are kind of two ways in which babies are born into the nest. And that can affect a little bit how the nest is made. One kind of baby is what we call precocial. Like they're precocious, right? They're actually born ready to go. Or almost. So their eyes are open, they're covered with at least a good amount of down feathers. And so here's an example of the wood duck. And I hope you've seen some footage of the wood duck, precocial wood duck. After it's born, not too long afterwards, the mother will go out of the nest and start calling to it, and the babies launch themselves out of the nest. And wood ducks nest 6 to 8 feet above the ground, and so they can't fly yet, so they actually just jump out and drop onto the ground and kind of bounce off the ground, and it's pretty humorous to watch. So if you haven't seen that, check out some footage. You can find some online. But some birds, like baby robins, are born helpless, and that's called altricial, where they don't really even have downs, so they really rely on their parent to be there to keep them warm. They can't see, they can, barely get their necks up to accept the food the parent is bringing. And we'll talk more about that next week when we talk about development. But I want to talk about the different kinds of nests that there are. So the first kind is called a scrape. So scrapes are basically little depressions in the ground. There's hardly anything to them. They might not even be much of a depression. Sometimes it's not even hardly anything at all that you could notice. Okay, they're just a little scrape on the ground. And this tends to be shorebirds, birds that live along the shores of lakes and or oceans, terns, skimmers, and nighthawks, and they tend to be in open conditions, right? So you don't have a lot of trees. You don't want to go way away from your natural habitat if you're a shorebird to have your young, and so you just make a nest in the open area, and that's called a scrape. Another type of nest is a burrow. So there are birds that nest in burrows. It's probably started with natural burrows or burrows from, say, mammals that birds adapted. But now there are some that will do some excavating by themselves. Burrows are pretty safe places. They tend to have a very stable microclimate. So a lot of birds have to spend a lot of time keeping their eggs the right temperature, right? If it's really hot, they've got to keep their eggs cool. If it's cold, they got to keep them warm. Well, burrows is pretty much the stable temperature the whole way. So as long as the egg can handle that climate, it's good to go. It's pretty good predator protection. All you have to do is defend the doorway. There really aren't any other ways for it to get in. But it does take time to make. If you can nest in a burrow, though, it seems that the success rate is pretty good. So success rate of eggs successfully hatching and maturing is 66% in burrows, where it's about 55% in cup nests, was the kind we're used to. So it does seem like a pretty good strategy. You have to be somewhere where burrowing is fairly easy to do. So again, this tends to be in open areas or places that have, think of the Southwest, like there's burrowing owls, where there are big open areas where you can make burrows pretty easily. Then there are cavity nesters. Of course, we think of cavity nesters as nesting in, say, tree trunks, but there actually are cavity nesters that build in other kinds of things like cactus, a cactus or cacti. So you can see a flicker. This is a red-shafted flicker, which is the western version. So primarily cavity nesters build their own nest, but then there are secondary cavity nesters who find a usable cavity. So, they will find a cavity made by another bird or a natural cavity in a tree. And there's a lot of competition for holes. If you've ever watched, say, somebody who had a bluebird box, you will find a lot of birds trying to check that bluebird box out and use that bluebird box. And in fact, a couple of different species might use that same bluebird box, because not only bluebirds use bluebird boxes over the course of the season. So, you might start out with a tree swallow, and then at the end a house wren might come afterwards. So there's a lot of competition for cavity nests because, there's only so many sites. There's something called a platform nest. And you've probably seen platform nests where humans have created a platform for the purpose of allowing for a platform nest. These are usually larger birds. This is a primitive kind of nest. There's not a lot of intricate weaving that often goes into these. They can be lined with vegetation or feathers, but usually they're just sticks piled up and then, some lining put into it. Interesting with platform nests is that they tend to be used over and over again. With some of the other kinds of nests that we see, like cup nests that we're going to talk about next, birds often use those only once. But platform nests can be used over and over and over again, and usually the birds add to them every year, so they kind of get bigger and bigger and bigger. So there have been stories in Indiana, where I lived before moving to Vermont. There was a tree that had an eagle nest in it, and literally these nests can weigh thousands of pounds. So eventually the tree fell over because the eagle nest was just so huge. So let's talk a little bit about cup nests. These are what we think of when we think of nests. They probably evolved from a platform nest, right? If you had a platform nest and the wind or predators or other things kept knocking your eggs off the edge, maybe you'd start building the edges up. Birds that started building the edges up a little bit were more successful, and so that trait got passed along. They're really better for keeping eggs in place, and it provides some hiding as well. So if a bird is sitting on the nest, often you can't see it as well. And also it holds in heat. Remember, you have to try to keep your eggs at a very constant temperature, which is not easy. So if you can sort of have that nest go around your body, you can control that temperature pretty well. There are different kinds of cup nests. So now we're going to talk about some subcategories of the cup nest. There's the adherent kind, where it's usually mud and or saliva. So it's really awesome to watch, say, barn swallows or bank swallows. Not bank swallows. What other kinds of swallows around here would make a cup nest? An adherent nest. I don't know. Barn swallows are the one I think of. And you watch them and they will go to mud puddles and gather up mud, and then, it's mixed obviously in their mouth with the saliva, and then they bring it back and they make some pretty awesome nests that sort of it's like clay, and that they attach to buildings and roofs. And a lot of times, like cliff swallows will be on the undersides of bridges and roads. Of course, originally when there were no bridges and roads, they were attached to cliff sides. But those are adherent nests. Now, there's pensile nests. These are open at the top, and you'll see that the top of the nest is at the branch level, and they hang down below the branch. Okay, this is really common. This is red-eyed vireo. They're really common with a lot of the warblers. A lot of the vireos make these pensile nests. They're often in the fork of a branch. You probably can't see it here, but imagine that this is a forked branch. So it creates a nice little place for the rim of the nest. Now we do have pendulous nests. So these hang down from the branch quite a ways, okay? And these do not open from the top, they open from the side. So the bird comes in from the side, and then the weight of the bird sitting inside sort of closes off the opening, so that it's actually a very good protection strategy. Pendulous nests, the bird I think of around here, of course, is the Baltimore oriole, and they make nests out of string and or hair. It's interesting. Now, if you find a Baltimore oriole nest, it'll probably be mostly string. I don't know how they find so much string, but it's pretty amazing. That's what they're usually made of. 100 years ago, a Baltimore oriole nest probably would have been almost entirely horsehair, because everyone had horses and there was a lot of horsehair available. Now, they've had to make do with other things. Obviously, before horses, they were probably using just other natural fibers, tree bark, things that are very filamentous, like hair is. People still put out hair. Some people take the hair off their hairbrush and put it out on the shrubs, and sometimes orioles will come and use that for their nests as well. So there are pendulous nests that are huge in Africa and other places that hang down several feet. They're pretty impressive. Another kind of cup nest is the dome nest. This is covered on the top, and so again, it's open on the side. So it's almost like an upside down cup, and the bird goes inside. The bird I think of around here that does this, one of the birds is the ovenbird, and it's called the ovenbird because the nest sort of looks like an old-fashioned dome clay oven. That's how it got its name. So, though there are birds though that don't make any nests, and we've talked about this before. This is our friend the brown-headed cowbird, and its strategy is not to make its own nest, but rather to lay its eggs in other birds' nests, and then birds will often raise the cowbird egg and young as their own. So here's an example. Here is a nest. You see, these are the baby birds from the bird who made the nest, and then this is the cowbird baby. Notice how much bigger it is. Cowbird babies, that's part of the strategy, is it's big, it can get the resources that the parents bring. Here's a great photo of a little, I think that is a common yellowthroat, feeding a baby brown-headed cowbird. Look how big the baby is, even bigger than this common yellowthroat. Hopefully, I don't know, maybe that common yellowthroat was very proud of its very, very big offspring. You can see the eggs in the nest here. So here's some warbler eggs with the cowbird eggs in. And this many cowbird eggs in a nest like this, those eggs are probably none of those warbler eggs will be successful. Sometimes they will be, but often not, because even the big baby cowbirds will sort of push the other little ones physically out of the nest. So they often die that way as well. So a lot of people are really against cowbirds. I'm not a fan of cowbirds, but it is a pretty amazing strategy. And they're not the only birds that do it. Cuckoos, especially European cuckoos, do this pretty regularly. And a lot of birds will nest dump eggs with their own species. So a hooded merganser, which is a bird that we might have around here, will often have its own nest and it'll have its own eggs there, but then every once in a while it'll go and lay an egg in another bird's nest, just in case its nests fail. It's kind of got a backup plan, and the other bird doesn't know that it's not their own necessarily. So let's talk a little bit about the eggs themselves. Eggs vary in color and shape. They can be almost spherical to kind of these weird pear-shaped, to conical, to this elliptical or oval, which you might think about a chicken egg. They come in a range of colors and sort of colorations. Probably the ancestral color is white, because that's a color of the calcium that builds up, that forms the egg shell. So white, but then adaptations occurred that helped the eggs survive and not get predated. So generally, eggs of birds who nest on the ground or in shrubs that are fairly low to the ground have developed on a large amount of spotting. This spotting definitely makes sense for camouflage purposes, and it makes sense that eggs that are on the ground or near the ground are going to need more camouflage. But they've also found that this spotting helps the shell be harder as well. So perhaps this is an adaptation to eggs that are going to be like sitting on rocks and might get bumped around. Maybe it helps them survive longer as well. Birds who nest higher in the trees often have brighter eggs. So here you have the picture of the robin egg that we're all familiar with, that bright blue color. Some recent research has been showing that this might actually be a signal to the male about the health of his offspring, so of his mate and his offspring. So a healthy female who had a lot of vitality to give to probably have healthy offspring often has bluer eggs. And this has been shown that the males will tend to feed bluer eggs more. So, often the female's sitting on the nest and the male is going and foraging and providing food, and they actually sort of work harder to feed bluer eggs. or obviously the chicks that came out of bluer eggs. So that's a little bit, I don't know, it's sort of disheartening to me, but that's the way nature is sometimes. One other thing, and that is that the conical shape that we see, where it's really pointed on one end of the egg, these are often with cliff dwelling birds and ground nesting birds that have scrapes, because these eggs, if you think about rolling one of these eggs, it's going to roll in a circle and it's not going to roll off the nest. So, in a place where rolling off the nest would be super dangerous, like off the edge of a cliff, or someplace where rolling might be easy, like on a flat scrape, these tend to have more conical nests. So again, we have a killdeer nest, and notice the eggs tend to be arranged with the pointed side in. So then they sort of all touch each other and they don't move. So it's a pretty good system. The overall shape of the egg, though, that's sort of not spherical, even though there's some that are close to spherical, most of them are not. It seems that shape is actually an adaptation. Eggs are semi-permeable, and there's air exchange that happens between the outside of the egg and the inside of the egg, and the air sac inside where the chick is it's important to have air exchange. That part tends to be at the back, where at the back end. So when an egg lays and its narrow point sort of goes down to the ground, imagine that sort of puts the blunt edge of the egg up in the air, allowing for more air exchange. So that's the current hypothesis. There's still a lot of unknowns about eggs and where all the coloration comes from and all of that. Still a lot of unknowns and a lot of research that's still being done. So that is our lesson on nest and nesting.